The war in Europe is entering its final, desperate months when something unexpected begins to happen along Sweden's southern horizon. Ships and buses painted white with red crosses arrive carrying people who look more like shadows than survivors. A country that escaped the destruction of war suddenly becomes a triage ground, receiving men, women, and children faster than officials can record their names. In February 1945, negotiations began between Count Folke Bernadotte and German authorities. The mission that results the white buses will eventually extract thousands from concentration camps across Germany and Denmark. At the ports of Malmö and Trelleborg, the first convoys roll in by late March. Doctors, Red Cross volunteers, and hastily deployed military medics are waiting. But what they see overwhelms even the most experienced among them. Reports describe long lines of stretchers, makeshift quarantine tents, and the urgent search for food, clean water, and safe shelter. More than 15,000 people will arrive in the spring alone, many within days of each other. For Sweden, this moment is both moral and logistical. The country had maintained its neutrality through the war, avoiding bombing campaigns and widespread destruction. Now its greatest challenge is not enemy invasion, but the scale of human need pouring across its borders. Debates unfold in Stockholm. How far should a neutral nation extend its help, and at what cost? Some newspapers warn about contagious diseases entering the country. Others argue that these survivors, many of them Scandinavian prisoners, evacuated through negotiated exchanges, deserve immediate protection regardless of risk. Government ministries call emergency meetings, trying to balance compassion with limited administrative capacity. What happens next is improvisation on a national scale. Schools close temporarily, so they can be converted into dormitories. Military barracks are scrubbed, refitted, and transformed into reception centers almost overnight. Local authorities attempt to coordinate with national agencies, but procedures are unclear. Every morning brings another train or ship, another unpredictable number of arrivals. Volunteers bring blankets, clothing, and food. Yet the flow of people remains larger than the system's ability to absorb them. Inside the reception centers, the Red Cross and Social Styrelsen create a routine, fragile, but functional. New arrivals pass through mandatory disinfection, medical examinations, and registration tables where clerks attempt to extract fragments of identity from people who may not have spoken for days. Many survivors have no documents, no possessions, and, in some cases, no idea where their families are. Interviewers must rely on memory, a birthplace, a childhood landmark, a relative's name that might help trace them. Even these fragments are often clouded by exhaustion or illness. Medical teams confront a range of conditions the country had rarely encountered at such a scale. Respiratory infections, untreated wounds, starvation-related complications, and suspected tuberculosis. Nurses write that sometimes the first task is simply to help survivors stand upright long enough to move to the next station. Psychological distress is present but poorly understood. Sweden has few structures for supporting the mental trauma that accompanies liberation from the camps. Much of the early care focuses on stabilizing bodies before addressing the deeper, less visible wounds. Meanwhile, local communities watch the influx with a mix of sympathy and worry. Some Swedes line the docks, offering fruit or blankets to arriving buses. Others express concern about whether resources already strained by wartime rationing can support such sudden population growth. Editorials debate whether Sweden's humanitarian efforts will jeopardize economic recovery or public health. The discussions are rarely hostile, but they reveal a nation unsure of how to respond to a crisis it did not expect to shoulder. The government's first attempt at standardization arrived in June 1945, when unified reception protocols were established. These guidelines define how every refugee, Scandinavian or not, should be treated upon arrival, where they go, how they are screened, and what records must be kept. Officials hope this will bring order, yet the reality remains chaotic. Some reception centers develop efficient routines, Others struggle with shortages of staff, supplies, or trained interpreters. Each new group of arrivals pushes the system back toward the edge of capacity. Still, amid the strain, moments of resilience emerge. Volunteers teach basic Swedish phrases to children while they wait for medical clearance. Local families donate clothing and help sort supplies. Some survivors offer to assist with translation or camp organization, helping reintroduce structure into their own lives. Slowly, the reception centers evolve from emergency shelters into places where the first steps toward recovery can begin. Yet even as Sweden adapts to this humanitarian surge, officials sense that the situation remains fragile. The white buses convoys will not continue forever, but the instability of post-war Europe suggests that displaced people may continue seeking refuge long after the camps are liberated. Stockholm ministries begin quietly preparing for a possible second wave, one that might not be as predictable or easily categorized, and they are right to worry. Within weeks of Germany's surrender, small fishing boats started appearing off Sweden's eastern coast. They carry families from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, people fleeing not collapsing Nazism but the advance of Soviet authority. Unlike the camp survivors, their legal status is unclear, their identities harder to verify, and their political implications far more complicated. Sweden believes the crisis will ease now that the war is over. Instead, the country is about to enter a new, uncertain chapter, one shaped not by negotiated rescue missions, but by thousands of stateless individuals arriving without warning, challenging Sweden to decide who will be allowed to stay, and under what conditions, before its camps begin to overflow. The summer of 1945 should have brought calm to Sweden's coastline. The war is over. The white buses' missions are winding down, and officials hope the emergency structures built in spring will finally catch their breath. But in May, fishermen along Gotland and Blekinge notice unfamiliar silhouettes moving across the water. Small craft, heavily loaded, running fast despite rough seas. As they draw closer, it becomes clear these are not trading vessels, but improvised refugee boats arriving without warning, carrying people who have nowhere else to go. The first groups stagger ashore, exhausted, sunburned, and drenched in salt water. Many have fled only hours after Soviet forces reached their towns in Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania. They bring stories of arrests, deportations, and a political order shifting too rapidly for civilians to predict. But unlike the evacuees of the white buses, these new arrivals carry no formal agreements, no negotiated permissions, and few papers to explain who they are. Their presence forces Sweden to confront questions it has not yet answered. What does neutrality mean when the displaced flee from both sides of a recently ended war? The Coast Guard and local police develop improvised routines to manage landings. Officers escort refugees to temporary shelters, begin basic medical checks, and separate families only when necessary for quarantine or emergency treatment. Some boats land at night, guided in by lanterns or the faint hope of reaching any coastline that offers safety. Others are intercepted offshore, taken in tow by patrol vessels to prevent capsizing in the choppy Baltic waters. Reports from the period describe scenes of confusion, children crying, adults searching for missing relatives, interpreters scrambling to translate multiple languages at once. What makes this influx so challenging is not only the numbers. Archival estimates suggest around 30,000 Baltic refugees will reach Sweden by the late 1940s, but also the uncertainty surrounding their legal status. Are they political refugees, stranded laborers, or people simply seeking a better future in a stable country? Swedish authorities attempt to distinguish between categories, but the lines blur quickly. Some refugees fear that giving too much information will lead to forced repatriation. Others overstate credentials in hopes of gaining approval. Identity verification becomes a daily struggle for clerks who must judge truth in a landscape of half-remembered documents and conflicting accounts. Soviet officials soon take notice. Moscow protests that some refugees are Soviet citizens who should be returned. Swedish diplomats face pressure to cooperate, yet the government hesitates. Forced repatriations risk violating emerging humanitarian norms, but full rejection of Soviet demands threatens delicate post-war neutrality. Ministers debate how to respond without appearing to shelter political opponents of the USSR or escalating tensions during a fragile peace. Each landing on the Baltic coast becomes not just a humanitarian event, but a potential diplomatic test. Public sentiment shifts again as the Baltic sailings continue. Local newspapers question who these refugees are and whether Sweden, still rationing goods, can support such numbers. Rumours spread that some arrivals may be economic migrants, coming not from immediate danger but from post-war hardship. Yet many Swedes volunteer at reception centres, recognizing that these families are stepping into an unknown future with no guarantee of return. Sympathy and anxiety coexist, shaping a national mood that is neither welcoming nor hostile, but cautious. Inside the processing centres, the atmosphere differs markedly from the spring evacuations. Survivors of the camps arrived visibly weakened, making their need self-evident. Baltic arrivals appear healthier, which leads some officials to treat them with greater suspicion. Repeated interviews probe their pasts, their political affiliations, and the reasons they risked dangerous crossings. Clerks note inconsistencies, but they also understand that memories can falter under stress, and that wartime borders have shifted so dramatically that nationality has become a moving target. Some families are granted temporary residence pending further review. Others wait for months in repurposed barracks, neither admitted nor expelled. At camp meetings, refugees begin forming committees to communicate with Swedish officials and organize schooling for children. They debate whether Sweden will become their permanent home or simply a stop until they can return to a Baltics that, for now, exists only in memory. All the while, the pressure builds. Camps that were already crowded after the white buses operations now expand beyond planned capacity. Warehouses store extra bedding, municipalities open more barracks and requisition old school buildings. Officials worry about what will happen if the flow continues unchecked. Will Sweden's limited administrative system collapse under the burden of sorting thousands of undocumented newcomers? Every new arrival sharpens the dilemma. To reject people would violate the spirit of humanitarianism that Sweden had embraced only months earlier. To accept everyone risks diplomatic conflict and domestic strain. Policy debates intensify in Stockholm. What criteria should determine who stays? How can the state balance sympathy with security without tipping into exclusion or appeasement? As summer turns to autumn, the Baltic crossings show no sign of stopping. The boats arriving at dawn, the evening rescues, the whispered stories of arrests back home, they all hint that a long-term shift is underway, not a temporary emergency. Swedish authorities now face a decision more complex than the spring evacuations. They must determine how to classify and accommodate a population whose identities are contested, whose futures are uncertain, and whose numbers may soon exceed the capacity of every camp in the country. Sweden has adapted once already. But the next test will determine more than logistics. It will reveal whether the nation can rebuild lives when it barely understands the people arriving, and before it has figured out how to rebuild its own sense of stability. The first Baltic sailings have barely been absorbed when Sweden confronts another reality. Most refugees who arrive, whether from camps in Germany or from boats crossing the Baltic Sea, will not be able to move directly into ordinary Swedish life. Their health is fragile, their language is unfamiliar, their identities incomplete. The emergency shelters of spring now need to become something more structured, more sustainable. Sweden begins building a system that must restore not only physical strength but human capacity itself. Across Norrland, Skåne, and Södermanland, the converted barracks fill quickly. Some are former military buildings, others are schoolhouses or hastily assembled wooden structures meant to last a few months but destined to stand for years. Inside, the daily routine stabilizes. Morning roll call, medical checks, disinfection procedures. Nutrition schedules were designed to help malnourished bodies recover without overwhelming fragile systems. It is here, in these improvised facilities that the state attempts to turn emergency care into orderly administration. Social Styrelson issues guidelines-thin documents that mix medical advice with welfare principles were still in development. Every new arrival undergoes tuberculosis screening, a priority in a country deeply concerned about airborne disease. Nurses collect sputum samples, manage isolation rooms, and monitor fevers through the night. Doctors conduct psychiatric evaluations. Though their tools are limited, psychological trauma is recognized but poorly mapped. Reports describe symptoms of sleeplessness, anxiety, and emotional withdrawal. Yet treatments remain rudimentary, focused more on calming routines than on formal therapy. Nutrition programs become a cornerstone of recovery. Kitchens, staffed by both Swedes and refugees, prepare meals rich in calories and vitamins. Children receive supplements, while adults with severe deficiencies follow regulated diets. Many refugees express confusion at Swedish food customs. Some have not tasted fresh milk or potatoes in months. Staff learn to adjust menus while still following rationing rules, creating meals that are nourishing, palatable, and culturally sensitive enough to avoid unnecessary distress. Education becomes the next critical front, with thousands of displaced children inside the camps, and many more arriving through the Baltic sailings. Temporary classrooms form. Swedish teachers, often recruited locally, step into unfamiliar pedagogical territory. They must teach language, basic subjects, and social norms to students whose educational experiences vary wildly. Some children have not attended school in years. Others were enrolled only weeks before fleeing. The goal is modest: restore routine, spark learning, and create spaces where children can begin imagining futures beyond displacement. In many camps, children display signs of trauma, restlessness, sudden silence, or intense attachment to adults. Teachers, lacking formal training in trauma care, rely on instinct and patience. They introduce games, songs, and gentle exercises that blend structure with comfort. Archival accounts describe moments when a child begins speaking again after weeks of silence, or when sibling groups cling to each other during lessons, unwilling to be separated for even a minute. Every small breakthrough becomes part of the slow work of rebuilding trust. To supplement Swedish instructors, refugee adults with teaching backgrounds sometimes volunteer. They help bridge cultural gaps, translate instructions, and maintain continuity with the children's home languages. Their participation becomes an early example of refugee self-governance, an emerging feature of larger camps. Committees form to organize chores, mediate disputes, and liaise with Swedish officials. These committees give refugees a measure of autonomy and reduce administrative burdens on overstretched staff. Adults face their own challenges. Many are eager to work, not only to earn income, but to regain dignity. Yet labor integration is still months away. Health checks are required, identity papers must be verified, and workplaces remain uncertain. In the meantime, language instruction begins. Classes are informal at first, phrases written on chalkboards, vocabulary lists exchanged in hallways, pronunciation lessons practiced after dinner. Some refugees pick up Swedish quickly, others struggle, especially older individuals who fear they may never master a new language. As the camp system matures, Sweden shifts from a charity mindset to something more structured. Welfare principles become central. Refugees should receive not only emergency care, but stable support, aimed at long-term rebuilding. This reflects broader social thinking influenced by figures like Gunnar and Alva Myrdal, whose work shapes contemporary debates on social justice and public responsibility. Though not directly designing refugee policy, their ideas echo through discussions about how to integrate newcomers without reproducing inequality. Still, the system's limits remain visible. Overcrowding persists. Some barracks lack insulation, making winters in the northern camps bitterly cold. Interpreter shortages slow processing and increase frustration. Refugees sometimes wait months for updates on family tracing requests, relying on fragmented Red Cross networks to locate relatives scattered across Europe. For children separated from parents, the uncertainty becomes a defining feature of camp life. And teachers must manage the emotional fallout with few tools beyond reassurance. Yet amid these difficulties, human relationships gradually take shape. Local Swedes visit the camps to offer books, clothing, or musical instruments. Children begin playing football with Swedish students. Religious groups organize modest services, sometimes in improvised chapels carved out of storage rooms. These interactions, though inconsistent across regions, help soften cultural barriers and introduce refugees to everyday Swedish life beyond the camp's narrow boundaries. By early 1946, a new problem emerged. Even if people recovered their health, learned basic Swedish, and participated in camp routines, what came next? The barracks cannot hold them indefinitely. Schools alone cannot build a future. The welfare system is not an end in itself, but a bridge to something larger. Sweden must now determine whether it can provide workplaces, housing, and community structures that will transform temporary shelter into lasting integration. And so the question begins to shift. The first challenge was survival. The second was recovery. Now, Sweden must confront a third. How to match tens of thousands of refugees with an economy in transition, without igniting resentment among Swedish workers already uneasy about the post-war years. The answer will take the nation from classrooms and clinics into factories, forests, and mines, where integration becomes tangible and far more contested. By 1946, the camps had stabilized. Medical routines had taken hold, and children were back in makeshift classrooms. But Sweden now faces the question that will shape the refugees' future more than any health check or language lesson. Where will they work? Without pathways into employment, integration cannot move beyond barracks and temporary shelters. With tens of thousands of arrivals and a growing labor shortage in key industries, the state attempts a solution that is both practical and political, using work as the bridge from displacement to belonging. The National Labour Market Board, AMS, expanded its authority early in 1946. Its task is clear: match refugees with the industries that desperately need workers. Sweden's economy is accelerating after years of wartime constraints. Mines in Kiruna and Malmögetti require manpower to meet export demands. Forestry brigades across Norrland are short of labour to feed sawmills and the paper industry. Textile factories in Borås struggle to keep up with orders. Shipyards in Gothenburg and along the northern coast need welders, riveters, and machinists. To Swedish planners, refugee labour offers an opportunity if the transition can be managed without undermining social stability. For many refugees, the shift from camps to workplaces begins with interviews held in barracks offices. Officials ask about previous occupations, language skills, and physical capacity. Records from the period show wide variation. Some refugees were teachers, clerks, or professionals. Others had backgrounds in agriculture, fishing, or factory work. AMS officers must determine who can be placed where, balancing individual preferences with economic necessity. The process is imperfect, and misunderstandings are common. Yet for refugees who have spent months waiting, even a mismatched assignment can feel like a step toward normal life. Inside the industries themselves, the results are mixed, but often quietly successful. In textile mills, refugee women join production lines, learning weaving techniques from Swedish supervisors who may not share a common language but quickly develop working routines. Forestry brigades recruit young men from Estonia and Latvia, who adapt to the physical demands of timber clearing under harsh northern winds. Mines recruit small groups of Baltic and Central European workers, pairing them with Swedish crews willing to train newcomers in safety procedures and equipment handling. Though many workplaces embrace the influx, not all reactions are positive. Swedish labour unions, committed to protecting wages and work standards, express cautious concern They fear that large numbers of refugees still learning Swedish and unfamiliar with collective bargaining could unintentionally weaken union leverage or create downward pressure on wages. Union reports from 1946 show debates about whether refugee labor strengthens the national economy or threatens hard-won labor protections. Ultimately, most unions cooperate once reassurances are given that refugees will work under the same contracts and safety rules as Swedish employees. Gender differences shape the integration landscape. Women, particularly those from the Baltic countries, enter the textile, domestic, and caregiving sectors. Many find these environments relatively accessible, with supervisors who value precision and reliability over linguistic fluency. Men are more often directed toward heavy industry mining, metalworks, shipyards, and forestry, where the physical demands are high, and accidents are an ever-present risk. Despite shared hardship, cultural differences occasionally cause friction. Some workers struggle to adapt to Swedish timekeeping norms or collaborative practices. Others are frustrated by the slower pace required for safety. Language remains a daily challenge on factory floors and in forest camps. Misunderstandings lead to mistakes, and supervisors must repeat instructions frequently. To ease transitions, some workplaces establish evening language classes or informal tutoring sessions. Refugee workers practice vocabulary related to tools, measurements, and safety commands. These efforts, though uneven across regions, help accelerate integration and reduce tension between Swedish and refugee crews. Over time, small stories circulate that illustrate how work reshapes identity. A Lithuanian mechanic in a shipyard becomes known for solving complex assembly problems. A group of Estonian foresters organizes weekend dances that attract Swedish locals, creating unexpected cultural exchanges. A Polish metalworker teaches colleagues a new welding technique he learned before the war. These moments, while modest, signal that refugees are contributing not just labor, but skills and community presence. Yet the integration through work strategy is not without strain. Housing shortages impede progress. Workers placed in remote mines or forests often live in crowded barracks or shared rooms, some originally designed for short-term military use. Municipalities struggle to allocate apartments for families, and refugees separated from spouses or children face painful delays in reunification. For them, employment represents opportunity but also isolation. Economic pragmatism also masks emerging political tensions. As Sweden's industries strengthen, Eastern Europe tightens under Soviet influence. Security officials begin to worry that among the refugees assigned to sensitive workplaces, especially those related to infrastructure or ports, might be individuals with unclear loyalties or coerced past affiliations. The more refugees spread into the national workforce, the more the state feels the need to understand who they truly are. By late 1946, the success of labor placement is unmistakable in numbers. Thousands of refugees are now employed across Sweden. Productivity increases help fuel post-war recovery. And many workplaces report that refugee crews integrate quickly once routines are established. Yet officials know that good economic outcomes do not resolve every fear. The more Sweden opens its institutions, its schools, its factories, and communities, the more vulnerable it becomes to geopolitical uncertainty brewing across Europe. And so, just as the economic picture brightens, political shadows lengthen. Reports flow into Stockholm, suggesting that Soviet pressure regarding Soviet citizens is intensifying. Police authorities request expanded screening powers. Agencies debate how to differentiate genuine refugees from potential risks without undermining humanitarian commitments. The question is no longer whether refugees can contribute to Sweden's economy. Many clearly can. The question becomes whether Sweden can balance integration with security as the post-war world divides. The next chapter will unfold inside ministries and security offices, where humanitarian ideals collide with Cold War anxieties, and where the fate of thousands hangs on decisions made far from forests and factories. By the start of 1947, the refugee camps were quieter and the factories busier. The great humanitarian emergency of 1945 has transformed into a structured, if imperfect, system of integration. But in Stockholm's ministries and police offices, a new unease emerges. The global order is shifting, and the lines between allies, victims, and potential threats are blurring. Sweden, determined to protect its neutrality, now begins examining the refugee population through a different lens, one shaped less by compassion and more by geopolitics. Security officials worry about what they cannot see. Tens of thousands of arrivals have entered Sweden over the past 2 turbulent years, many without complete documents, some without any documents at all. In 1945, that lack had been treated as understandable. The war had shattered identifications, families, and archives. By 1947, however, the same uncertainty was viewed with suspicion. The question circulating through the ministries is uncomfortable. Who exactly has Sweden allowed inside? New screening measures are introduced. Refugees are called to additional interviews, even those who have already settled into workplaces or begun learning Swedish. Officials ask about political affiliations, wartime movements, and personal networks. Some are questioned about forced labor service under German occupation. Others are asked whether they had any involvement with Soviet institutions. The intent is less accusatory than precautionary, but to many refugees, these interrogations feel like another ordeal after years of upheaval. Soviet pressure deepens the uncertainty. Moscow insists that many Baltic refugees are Soviet citizens who must be returned, sparking diplomatic friction. Swedish officials, conscious of the fragile post-war stability, seek to avoid inflaming tensions, yet they also fear violating humanitarian principles by sending people back against their will. Every request from the Soviet embassy forces the government to reconsider the boundaries of its neutrality. Are refugees to be treated as individuals seeking safety, or as subjects claimed by competing states? In some cases, Swedish authorities quietly review Soviet dossiers, though their reliability is often questioned. Reports from the period show that internal memos frequently warn of incomplete information or politically motivated accusations. Sustained ambiguity makes decision-making difficult. Some refugees wait months for residency decisions, their futures suspended in administrative limbo. Others, fearing forced repatriation, avoid authorities, creating new challenges for those attempting to maintain accurate records. The public begins to sense the shift in tone. Newspapers that once highlighted Sweden's humanitarian achievements now run cautious pieces about unknown elements within the refugee population. Editorials debate whether the country might be harboring individuals linked to wartime regimes or to rising communist movements. These concerns are often exaggerated, but they reflect wider anxieties about the unpredictable post-war landscape. Swedes who once volunteered at reception centres now wonder how the government can guarantee safety without betraying its moral commitments. Inside the agencies, the debate is more measured, but no less intense. Some officials argue that a neutral state must be vigilant. Others warn that suspicion, applied too broadly, risks punishing the innocent. The archives show signs of these tensions. Conflicting recommendations, requests for further evidence, and reminders that policy must remain consistent with Swedish law. Civil liberties advocates push back against indefinite detentions or excessive surveillance, insisting that refugees should not be treated as potential criminals simply because they fled shifting borders. For refugees themselves, the shadow of surveillance is felt most in uncertainty. A Latvian worker in a textile factory wonders whether a missing document from his hometown will jeopardize his application. An Estonian mother, whose husband is still missing, fears that giving incomplete answers might cast suspicion on her entire family. A Polish former prisoner, already cleared by earlier screenings, is called again for questioning about his movements during the war. Each interview becomes a test not only of identity, but of memory strained by trauma. Yet, even in this climate, fairness persists more often than fear. Many officials strive to maintain a balance between vigilance and empathy. When evidence is contradictory, decisions lean toward caution without cruelty. Interviews are conducted professionally. Appeals remain possible, and overt discrimination is discouraged. Sweden's commitment to legal process tempers its apprehension, though it cannot erase it entirely. By mid-1947, the government updated residency directives, incorporating security criteria into what had previously been a primarily humanitarian system. The changes formalize the state's right to conduct deeper background checks and to delay or deny applications when information is insufficient. They also clarify that no refugee should be repatriated solely on political grounds, an attempt to safeguard individuals from being caught in the middle of great power demands. Still, the human cost of this cautious approach continues to accumulate. Some families are separated by administrative delays. Some workers lose job opportunities while awaiting clearance. Some live in constant fear that a misinterpreted detail could end their hopes of staying. The broader Swedish public, meanwhile, becomes aware that merging refugees is not only a matter of shelter and employment, but of navigating a world where suspicion moves as quickly as relief. As December approaches, officials believe they have brought order to uncertainty. Most refugees have been identified, screened, or verified to the extent possible. The feared infiltration of enemy agents remains unsubstantiated, though not entirely dismissed. The state feels more certain about the population it has absorbed, certain enough to begin contemplating the next phase of policy. But security alone cannot define a future. Once the interviews end and the files are marked complete, Sweden must decide what long-term place these refugees will hold in its society. Will they be temporary guests, slowly phased out as Europe stabilizes? Or will their years of work, schooling, and community building lay the foundation for permanent residency? The answer will come not from police officers, but from Parliament, where Sweden is about to debate, more publicly and more decisively than ever, who belongs within its borders and on what terms. By late 1946, the anxiety inside ministries had not yet reached the rhythm of ordinary Swedish streets. While officials argue over security protocols, life for thousands of refugees unfolds in classrooms, workshops, church halls, and the crowded apartments of expanding urban neighborhoods. Here, far from the tense balancing acts of diplomacy and surveillance, integration takes on a quieter, more human form, one shaped by housing shortages, children's laughter, and the slow work of building trust. Housing remains the nation's most persistent obstacle. Wartime restrictions and limited construction mean that Sweden simply does not have enough apartments for its growing population. In cities like Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö, waiting lists stretch for months. Municipalities adopt temporary solutions. Military barracks repurposed into long-term residences, converted school buildings partitioned into small family units, and clusters of prefabricated huts erected on unused land. These are not ideal homes, but they provide stability after years of uncertainty. In some neighborhoods, Swedish families live wall-to-wall with Baltic and Central European newcomers. The proximity sparks small frictions, a misunderstanding over noise, a complaint about cooking smells, but it also fosters daily familiarity. Children begin playing together in stairwells and courtyards. Adults learn each other's routines. Shared laundries and communal spaces become the first venues of quiet cultural exchange. While not every district embraces diversity equally, many residents gradually adapt to neighbors who arrived with little more than a suitcase and a story. Schools become the central arena where belonging grows most visibly. In April 1947, Sweden formally introduced adapted Swedish language classes for refugee children. These lessons, held in regular schools but designed with slower pacing and bilingual assistance, allow students to integrate without being overwhelmed. Teachers describe the challenge of instructing children who not only speak different languages, but also carry memories of upheaval. Some students thrive quickly, mastering Swedish within months. Others struggle, weighed down by homesickness or fragmented educational backgrounds. Classrooms often reflect the broader tensions of the time. In some towns, parents worry that an influx of refugee students might stretch resources or slow instruction. Elsewhere, teachers enthusiastically incorporate cultural traditions from the Baltics or Central Europe into lessons, using history and geography exercises to promote understanding. Over time, mixed classes become more common, and the idea that schools must serve all children regardless of origin takes deeper root in Swedish educational policy. Religious institutions also play a subtle but significant role. The Lutheran Church, while dominant in Swedish society, frequently collaborates with Catholic, Orthodox, and Jewish groups to support refugees. Church basements host social gatherings, volunteer networks distribute clothing, choirs form that blend Baltic hymns with Swedish repertoire. For some refugees, these spaces offer familiar rituals and community support. For others, they provide a neutral ground to rebuild social ties in a country where they still feel like outsiders. As daily routines stabilize, refugees begin forming cultural associations of their own. Baltic choirs rehearse in community centers. Small newspapers circulate news from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Sports clubs organize matches that attract both refugees and Swedes. These associations serve dual purposes: preserving cultural identity while easing integration by creating structured, positive interactions with local society. In cities with larger refugee populations, weekend dances, film nights, and literary circles become common, shaping a sense of continuity with the homeland they left behind. Workplaces, too, become social spaces. Refugee workers invite Swedish colleagues to meals featuring familiar dishes from home. Swedish families introduce newcomers to midsummer traditions. While language remains an obstacle, shared labor softens barriers. Some refugees report feeling more accepted at work than in their neighborhoods, where suspicion occasionally lingers. Others find that Swedish co-workers provide their first clear sense of belonging, especially in industries where teamwork is essential for safety. But integration is not universal. In more rural regions, refugees may live far from Swedish families, surrounded almost entirely by others from their homeland. Isolation slows language acquisition and reduces opportunities for social exchange. Some Swedes remain wary, influenced by reports linking refugees to geopolitical tensions. Even in cities, housing segregation sometimes creates pockets where refugees feel welcome only among their own communities. These regional variations remind policymakers that integration cannot be measured solely by employment statistics or residency approvals. For refugees themselves, the emotional landscape is complex. Some embrace Swedish life with optimism, grateful for stability and opportunity. Others feel caught between two worlds, integrated enough to participate in society, yet still longing for a homeland they may never see again. Children often adapt fastest, shifting between languages with ease and forming friendships that will anchor them for decades. Adults, especially older individuals, face a more difficult path. They must navigate unfamiliar customs, rebuild professional identities, and adjust to a welfare system still evolving toward modernity. As the refugee population settles into Swedish towns and cities, a quiet question begins to emerge. What is their future here? Temporary housing cannot remain temporary forever. Schools cannot treat every child as a short-term visitor. Workplaces cannot assume that newcomers will depart once Europe stabilizes. The camps are no longer the center of the refugee crisis. Everyday life is. And in everyday life, uncertainty weighs heavily. Officials recognize this shift. Reports from 1947 and 1948 emphasize the need for clearer pathways to long-term residence. Municipalities request additional guidance, Refugees write letters asking whether they can bring relatives, purchase homes, or pursue advanced education. Each question reveals the same underlying truth. After years of displacement, people want roots. Sweden, however, has not yet answered. The administrative structures built between 1945 and 1947 were designed for temporary protection, not permanent settlement. The next decision must be larger, more decisive. It must determine who will be allowed to stay and under what legal and moral framework. As 1948 approaches, the issue cannot be postponed any longer. Families are building their lives, children are mastering Swedish, and employers are relying on refugee labour. The question of belonging has shifted from the camps to the halls of Parliament, where Sweden will soon debate what home truly means for those who crossed its borders in the shadow of war. Sweden had lived with its refugee population for 3 full years. What began as an emergency response to a humanitarian catastrophe has grown into a national experiment, one unfolding not in abstract policy papers, but in workplaces, schoolyards, and overcrowded housing blocks. Refugees are no longer transient shadows passing through ports. They are neighbours, co-workers, and classmates. Their presence forces Sweden to ask a question it can no longer delay. Will these people remain temporary guests, or will they become part of the nation's long-term fabric? Parliament opens its winter session with this debate at the forefront. Officials present reports documenting the scale of integration so far. Thousands employed in mines, forests, textile mills, and shipyards. Thousands more enrolled in language classes. Children now performing well in schools designed to bridge cultural divides. Municipalities argue that their planning depends on clarity housing, welfare distribution, and school capacity, all require predictable population numbers. Refugees themselves submit letters and petitions asking for the stability they have lacked for nearly a decade. The right to stay, to work without interruption, to bring family members left behind. Yet the decision is not straightforward. Some parliamentarians worry that offering permanent status could strain welfare institutions, still adjusting to rapid post-war change. Others fear the diplomatic consequences. Soviet representatives continue to insist that many Baltic refugees are Soviet citizens who should be repatriated. Accepting them permanently could be interpreted as a political stance in a world already dividing into East and West. Sweden's neutrality, officials remind each other, depends not on avoiding moral decisions, but on framing them in terms of humanitarian principles rather than ideological allegiance. Committees examine the evidence district by district. In some areas, refugees have integrated quickly, renting apartments, joining local associations, and adapting to Swedish customs while preserving their cultural traditions. In other regions, especially more remote municipalities, progress is slower. Language barriers remain high, and isolation hinders social cohesion. Archival sources show that processing times for residency vary wildly. Some applications are resolved in months, others are delayed for over a year due to missing documents or unresolved identity questions. In the midst of these debates, Social Styrelsen and the Labour Market Board provide testimony that shifts momentum. They report that refugees have become a reliable component of Sweden's recovering economy, especially in industries that struggled with labour shortages after the war. Productivity numbers improve in mines and forestry brigades. Textile factories note increased output. Shipyards meet deadlines that would otherwise have slipped. Officials argue that permanent residency would not only reward stability, but help integrate workers more deeply, reducing turnover and training costs. Legal experts weigh in as well. They propose frameworks for long-term residency that would allow refugees to access welfare services on a predictable basis, while still requiring ongoing documentation for those with incomplete identities. The proposal reflects a balance between security and inclusion. Refugees who pass background checks and demonstrate stable employment or schooling would qualify for renewable residency permits, which could eventually lead to full rights. Those with unresolved legal conflicts or contested citizenship claims would be reviewed more cautiously, but not automatically excluded. Public opinion, once sharply divided, begins to soften. Newspaper coverage in 1948 reflects a growing recognition that refugees have contributed to Swedish life in visible ways. Choir performances, cooperative housing projects, sports clubs, and local festivals all feature their participation. Stories circulate of refugee children winning school awards, of skilled workers saving factory operations, and of neighbors helping each other during harsh winters. While suspicion has not vanished, the broader mood now reflects familiarity rather than fear. Inside refugee communities, anticipation mixes with anxiety. Many recall the instability of the past decade: war, occupation, flight, uncertainty in makeshift camps, and fear another uprooting more than anything else. Some dream of returning to the Baltics, yet know that Soviet consolidation makes such hopes unlikely in the foreseeable future. Others contemplate onward migration to North or South America, but lack the resources or sponsorships to pursue it. A sizable portion simply want to stay in the country that sheltered them when their homes were lost. Parliament's debates culminate in late 1948 with a series of administrative reforms that, while not sweeping, provide the clarity long sought. Sweden introduces stable residency frameworks that allow most refugees who arrived between 1945 and 1947 to remain under clearly defined conditions. Children enrolled in Swedish schools gain the right to continue without interruption. Workers with documented employment can renew their permits more easily. Families are granted pathways to reunification, though bureaucratic hurdles persist. The decision is incremental rather than dramatic, cautious, consistent with Swedish political style. But its impact is profound. It signals a commitment not just to temporary protection, but to the idea that those who live, work, and study within Swedish society can become part of it. Refugees respond with relief. Communities begin planning futures measured not in months but in years. Sweden, for its part, steps more fully into the humanitarian identity that will define its post-war reputation. As 1948 draws to a close, officials look back on a journey they never planned to undertake. What began with white buses rolling into Malmö in early 1945 has become a national lesson in balancing ideals with pragmatism. The integration of refugees has tested Sweden's welfare institutions, diplomacy, security structures, and social cohesion. It has also challenged the country to see itself anew, not as a passive bystander to Europe's upheaval, but as an active participant in rebuilding the lives shattered by war. And although Sweden enters the 1950s believing it has navigated a unique challenge, these decisions quietly lay the groundwork for something larger. The systems built between 1945 and 1948 will become the template for future refugee policies, shaping how the nation responds to crises yet unseen. The story does not end here. It becomes the foundation of a humanitarian legacy that will echo far beyond the post-war years. Sweden's post-war choices still echo in today's refugee debates, raising questions about responsibility, identity, and the meaning of refuge. Share your thoughts on how nations confront these moments of moral decision. Like, comment, and subscribe to follow more untold histories from the edges of World War II.